One of the metaphors that I use is, if you've ever seen those people that have nothing better to do than to spend like 6 months of their life setting up like 3 million dominoes, and you watch it on YouTube, and then they push the first one over, and then you watch for 30 minutes like this just amazing thing happen, right? Of all these dominoes going down. And I liken my life to dominoes. And the first domino that God went to was the firm belief that I was right and you're not. Which is, that's not just true of Christianity, it's true of the human race. But when you put religious language and garb around it, it really becomes something fierce and something, it becomes dogmatism. And dogmatism is a poorly constructed tourniquet to stop the hemorrhaging of my faith. That's what it is. And so I'm not sure about this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak more passionately about it, because I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Pardon the French, right? So the tension exists for us of what do we hold on to, what do we jettison? Because there are things that I taught that I was convinced I was right. In fact, I was so vested in that kind of thinking that the gospel to me became salvation by education. So in other words, as a teacher, my job is to teach you all the right things to believe, because at the end of the day, when you die, what saves you is having the right belief system. And so being right is everything. Eternity hangs in the balance of being right. And I happen to be right. So if you disagree with me, well, I'm sorry, we can't both be right. You're wrong. And so when I would listen to people who disagreed with me, I'd be polite and I'd listen. But as I was listening, I was constructing reasons why I didn't agree with them, trying to build a case of why I was right and they weren't. Never allowing a different story or a different narrative to actually become the thing that evaluates me. So in other words, it kind of worked this way. And all the while, I would call myself teachable, right? And I have to tell you this story. This is just kind of funny. I was a senior in Bible college, and I remember I was sitting in this class, and I literally, right now, I mean, that was a long, long time ago, and I can remember the room, I can remember where I was seated, and we were sitting in, those chairs where it has the flip-up desk, right? Okay, and you can flip it back down, and it's just a chair. But I'm in one of those desks, and I'm sitting there, and we're having this class, and I remember the teacher. I don't remember anything he was saying. Like, if us teachers only knew, right? Like, we don't remember it. But I remember the class. And I remember this thought occurred to me. And it was like, I should be humble. And so, in the middle of class, I had this silent prayer to God. God, make me a humble man. And like a lightning bolt on the heels of that. I mean, I hadn't even finished the thought, it seemed like. In a moment of unguarded clarity, I didn't hear a voice, but the thought comes right on its heels. Why? And in my unguarded moment, I actually gave an honest answer. And the answer was, so other people would know I'm humble. And I remember the desk is there. And I went, oh, I am so screwed up. And I just put my elbow down on the desk and hit it. And I just sat there with my head in my hands. And I went, Oh my gosh. I want to be humble so other people will know that I'm humble. I'm a senior in Bible college. I've already spent 4 years studying the Bible. And I've been teaching it to a bunch of young kids for almost 3.5 years.
Where did you go to Bible?
I went to a school in Florida. It doesn't exist anymore. It was called Florida Bible College. And at the time, it was huge. There was like 1,000 students, 1,200 students. It wasn't a liberal arts school. It was just a Bible school. And we prided ourselves in that because we don't have time for a liberal arts education. We just need to learn the Bible. So what I would do is I would say that I'm teachable. I would say that I'm humble. And as you would speak or present to me an idea that was different than mine or a thought that was different than mine, I'm examining the value of that thought through the grid of my existing truth, okay? The pair of glasses that I'm looking at everything through. Everything that comes in had to go through this grid, this paradigm, so to speak, of what I believe. We would call that my worldview. It would have to go through that. And if it didn't agree with my worldview, the worldview became like one of those bug zappers outside that the bugs fly into, and it would zap it, and it's gone, it's done. And that's how I would listen to you. As opposed to allowing what you're saying to evaluate my bug zapper, my worldview. See, I was using my worldview to evaluate what you're saying, not allowing what you're saying to evaluate my worldview. So what happens is I never grow. I never change. I only change within the bubble that I'm already in. And it becomes more solid. It becomes more dogmatic. I become more convinced I'm right because I've just reinforced. The only things that I let in only reinforce what I already have. And we were taught this, at least I was. I was taught that, well, you don't question, you don't ask these kind of questions because that gives the devil room to sow doubt into your life. So you need to pick up your shield of faith, quoting Ephesians 6, and you need to quench the fiery darts of doubt of Satan. So when these questions come, John, like just don't even ask them. Just push them away. And that's what we were taught to do. That's what I taught to do. So for me, you guys, this journey wasn't just about me learning or changing or switching, jumping boats. I was vested not only in what I'd learned, but I had turned around and I was teaching it to other people for decades. As a person in a church, as a Bible college professor, and things. So the first domino for me that had to fall was, John, you're not always right. And when that fell, what it did was it created the space for me to give myself permission to take all those questions that I'd had all my life and actually look at them again. Well, here's the double-edged sword of that. The real reason that I hadn't entertained the questions was fear. I was afraid of what I'd find. I was afraid of being wrong, because if I'm wrong, if the whole thing is really this great big test, and I get there and I got the wrong answers, well, shoot, I'm screwed. So the thing that's motivating everything I'm doing, all of a sudden it was like God just raised this mirror up, and I took a look at it and goes, do you realize that everything you've been doing has been motivated by fear? So much so that I was like the little 5-year-old boy that, in the silence of his bedroom, hears a sound and immediately freezes, holds his breath, and listens as hard as he possibly can because he's convinced there's a monster in the room and it's under his bed. And when the domino fell, and I realized I may not be right about everything, and it created this space for me to ask questions, to give myself permission to ask these questions, it was like the little boy finally threw his covers off, raced to the edge of the bed, and looked. And you know what I found? I found a monster. And it was God. Now what do? I'm a frickin' Bible teacher. I've been doing it for 20 years. And I just discovered my monster is God. The God that I've been teaching people. The God that I'm convinced exists. Now what do? Well, you know, you don't want to lose your job, so you don't admit this to anybody. So what was the thing that precipitated this for me? Well, I can't point to any one thing. It was a lot of little things. Some maybe a little bit bigger than others, but it was a long process for me because things had been chipping away for a long time, eroding it, so to speak. Going to the boat metaphor, I remember getting in a different boat, and I felt like I was like in a little zodiac raft, bobbing up and down in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and all I could see was water. And I have no idea where I'm going. I have no idea where I am. All I know is I'm not going back where I came from. But it's another tension I'm now living in. The tension of, this is really uncomfortable. I don't like my life looking like Jell-O. I don't like this overwhelming sense of vagueness to my life. I mean, I was the guy who had the answers. I was the guy who studied the scriptures. I knew the arguments. I knew how to prove somebody wrong. I knew how to prove myself right. Blah, 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 right? And now, I don't know what I think about anything. Yeah.
And yet, when you were describing holding back the questions and the bug zapper,
Mm-hmm.
that was me, and hearing you describe that sounds exhausting.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And so, what do you do when you get exhausted? Well, not only is your life just completely out of control, like a roller coaster, screaming, with no brakes, but you just have to, you go into denial. I mean, Katie can tell you all the different things that you'll start doing, the mechanisms you'll use to compensate because of that. But at the core of it was fear. And the only thing I knew to do with fear was to try and live in spite of it. I didn't know that God could destroy fear. I just thought He could give you the courage to live with it. There's this statement in the Bible that says, there is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. What a bomb. You know how many times I read that and it never registered? Honestly, I can tell you honestly, I'd probably read 1 John 100 times and that never registered to me in decades. And you go, what is that? I don't know. But here's the thing, and I want to go back to what Joyce was saying. Even though this is my story, this is my narrative, I don't look back on all that time as wasted. I don't look back on all that time as, this is all junk, just throw it out. It isn't all junk, and I'm not going to throw it all out. But now I have the tension of, well, but some of it is, what do I jettison and what is precious? So this is the painful, arduous, incredibly, way too slow for me process of learning that. And I think it's going to take maybe another couple billion ages. And I'm not exaggerating. Do you really think you're going to have it all figured out when you die? You really think that God all of a sudden just goes pooing and then everything just makes sense when you die? And don't get me wrong, again, another tension. Will it be better when we die? I believe it will be. But does it mean everything? No, then This just literally does away with relationship. Everything becomes static and means you stop growing. You're not going to stop growing. Ever. Ever. When will you exhaust the beauty of the Father, Son, and Spirit? Do you really think you can? Really? See, I thought, like, well, I know the right answer. You can't, but, well, kind of, you know. So the first domino was, I'm right, you're not. That had to fall. Then there was this space where I gave myself permission to begin to ask questions. When that happened, my life had been, how do I make sense of a book, a text? How do I get answers to what this means? Because this is what God is revealing to the world, exclusively. And God doesn't reveal anything outside of this text. This is it. Anything that He does reveal, it has to match the text. So the text was my authority, exclusively. I'm not saying the text isn't authoritative, but I'm saying that in those days, it was authoritative exclusively. And so my goal in life was to try and study and learn and understand the text so that I could make sense of it, and I had answers to what it was trying to say. I was trying to figure out what does it mean and what does it say. At the end of the day, this is what had happened. I have this framework, and I figured out what I think this is all about and what God's like and what He has to say and what I'm supposed to do and blah, 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 at least to some degree, to the degree that at least I'm confident enough to be able to say I'm right and you're not. And at the end of it, I'm left with a God who's a monster. So I've got answers to a text, but I've got a God who's a monster. And I just went, I can't live there. And here was, I think, the final straw, because like I said, there's a bunch of things that happened that began to change that for me. The final straw was when I became a dad. I didn't get married till I was 37. And we had our first child when I turned 40. And I will never forget it. I shared this Sunday, a couple days ago, for those of you who were there. There were a couple of you who were there. So you'll have to hear this again. But when I became a dad, I remember when my son was born, and he was born, it was an emergency C-section. And they wheel my wife in there, they throw the clothes on me, and I come in and sit next to her, and, pop, there he is, there's my son. And he'd had some issues because of the length of the birth and his difficulty in being able to get out. Let me out. And so they put him down in the nursery, and they put him in, this is where my mind goes. I always think of those little clear plastic trays with French fries in them with the heat lamp on them. That's what they put him in. But I remember looking at my son, and I just became overwhelmed with not just a feeling, but the determined, absolute assurance that I loved this person more than anything I'd ever loved in my life. I wasn't taught it. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't manipulate myself into it. I didn't work or practice to get it. It just was. Instantaneously. I would have stood in front of a freight train for him, right there. And it dawned on me that I loved my son better than God loved me. And I said, that can't be. I can't. If that's true, well, then I'm not sure why we're all sitting here talking about this. We shouldn't be talking about a God that we say loves us, but we love better. And so I knew that this can't be, so something must be wrong with my vision, my perspective of God? Well, of course there is. That's why he looks like a monster to me. That's why I fear him. That's why I live in fear of him. And that was the thing that really kind of put me over the edge. This can't be. And I went, I don't know where to go from here. I don't know what to do. And my answer was to try and answer this educationally, intellectually, because that's just the way I was raised. That's my generation. And I'll tell you right now, I apologize for that to you, the next generation, because salvation is not by education. It's who what? It is, but it's also what I was taught. And I picked it up and I turned around and taught it too. So we just perpetuated it. The way I think of it is, I would say, we could debate this, but for a while now, Western civilization, one of the idols that we've bowed to is the God of reason. Certainly since the Enlightenment, we worship at the feet of the God of reason. And God goes, okay, so you want to talk about reason? Okay, I can talk that. And so Billy Graham leads millions of people to come to know Jesus through reason. But then I want you to ask Jesus if he thinks it's all about reason. I have a pretty good idea that he'll say, not really. It's about relationship. And there's a difference. Ask me to define my love for my wife. I can't do it. I can try and describe it to you. I can try and describe to you the love I have for my children. But can I define it? Can I quantify it? No. So that's where I am in my journey. I'm teaching in a Bible college, and things are eroding and disintegrating, and I'm loving every second of it. Because a friend of mine, we were traveling from Portland over to Central Oregon. We were actually going to Sun River, and we went over the mountains, and we got on the other side, the lee side of the mountains, and the clouds break and the sun came out, and we'd been talking for a good 90 minutes, and she said, I've been just going on ranting about all these things that I'm thinking and questioning and all this stuff, and I'm just like, and she said, well, it's obvious some things are really changing from you. How would you describe it? And no one had ever asked me that before. And so I thought for a second, and the landscape's going by, and I'm thinking, I'm literally, I remember this, I can see it in my mind. And I'm at the wheel, and I'm thinking, and I turned to her, I said, Kristen, I said, I don't know how, but the word that popped in my head when you asked me, and it hasn't left, is I feel free. I feel free. She looked at me and she said, I can tell. How cool is that? Didn't register at the moment, but I look back now and I go, wow, that's pretty cool. She could tell. Free from what? Free from fear. I no longer live in fear. So one of my questions would be, to go back to the metaphor of the boats, the boat is leaking, someone suggests there's another boat, and you get in that boat. Do you not think that boat's going to leak? Do you not think that what you think and believe right now, this day, April 30th, 2019, is wrong? Do you not think you're going to grow? You go, wait. That's too much. That's over the top. Like, that means there's nothing that I can anchor to. Oh, yes, there is. See, certainty that's a tease, okay? Because that promises something that it can't really deliver. What you really want, what I really want, is assurance. And I looked all my life to try and gain certainty through knowledge, through information. And I ended up with, I told you what I ended up with. And then I began to discover relationship. And relationship provides assurance. But that's a double-edged sword too. Because relationships can be brutal. And all of us have experienced that. Every one of us, to different degrees, have experienced the brutality of being betrayed, abandoned, made fun of, hated. The list goes on. By the people we care about the most. But here's the deal. If God is God, if God is anything like Jesus, and He is, then there is no betrayal. There is no abandonment. That doesn't exist with God. I know sometimes it looks like it. I get that. And we've had our cursing moments and our fights and our vents, and I probably will have more. But I know that He doesn't. And so there's a difference in assurance in a relationship, in being embraced by love, as opposed to, have I learned the right formula to get embraced? No, John, you are. Well, but do I believe the right things? That doesn't matter. You are. Wait. You embrace everybody? Why wouldn't I? Well, because they're wrong. And you're not? Well, yeah, I'm wrong sometimes, but I'm not as wrong as them. See, this is the conversation going on between me and God. One of millions, right? And you've never had that conversation or anything like it. So, the dominoes started to fall, and the first domino, theologically, was, and this is so, to me, fundamental, it's like ridiculous, but it was, well, who's God? Who is God? And that's not quite as easy a question to answer as we think it might be. I'm pretty sure I had that. And I didn't. So I was teaching the same Sunday school class that I mentioned earlier this afternoon in this church, where the guy came up to me and handed me the shack. I was teaching at that same class, different year, but I started off the class this way. I said, I want to ask you guys a question. There were about 150 people in that class. It was a big church. And I said, I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you, how many of you have been here for 5 years? You've been going to this church for 5 years. And pretty much every hand in the room went up. I said, okay, keep them up. I said, how about 10 years? You've been here for 10 years, and a few hands went down. And I just kind of went through it. The church was 33 years old at the time. And I went through it, and more hands went down. And by the time I got to the end, how many of you have been here since the day one? Like you were there at the first service. And there were like a dozen hands waving. Yeah, I was there. I was the first one. I said, okay, wow, great. It's awesome. I said, so here's my question. I said, in those 33 years, or in however many years you've been here, how many sermons or Bible studies, growth groups, small groups, women's groups, men's groups, prayer groups, any type of meeting that the church does, have you ever had a conversation about the Trinity? And they all looked at me. And I waited. And they're buzzing back and forth. And I remember hearing someone, I don't remember who it was, but I remember they were over here, and I remember hearing them say, I can't remember any. And after a couple minutes, the consensus finally became, none of them could remember one time, ever. And I said, okay, now, before you go any further, I said, I'm not saying this to condemn the pastors or to find fault with the staff. I said, I'm one of the teachers. I would be condemning myself. But in that sense, I am. Because I've had 29 years. I've been going to that church for 29 years. I've had 29 years of opportunities to talk to you and have us have a conversation about the Trinity. And we never have. Ever. Not once. So, who's God to these people? Well, if you'd asked me, I would have said, well, yeah, of course God's Trinity. Of course God exists as three persons. But ask me like what impact or what effect that had on my life. It had none. Literally none. I never thought about, when I prayed, I didn't pray to three persons in relationship. I prayed to a singular deity in isolation, an individual. You say, well, what difference does that make? Oh my gosh. It makes every difference you can possibly imagine. Let me throw a couple out and then we'll talk and take a break. So, I remember reading, and some of you will remember this, some of you are old enough to remember this. Back in, I believe it was the early 70s, I want to say 1971. A guy named J.I. Packer wrote a book called Knowing God. And at the time I read that book, and I would have said in 1971, I'd been following Jesus for about 10 months, and I would have said that was the best book I ever read. And as a result, I read the book for once a year for about 6, 7, 8 years. Thanks, Katie. So, the reason I bring the book up is because if you read that book, look for where Mr. Packer, Dr. Packer, Reverend Packer, he's a great man. And I don't mean any disrespect by that. But look for where he talks about the Trinity. It's not there. So what kind of God are you knowing? But here's the thing. It gets worse. As he laid out, essentially what he does is he lays out different attributes, what we call attributes of God. And what we're basically talking about when you say an attribute of God, you guys know this. We're trying to describe characteristics of this person. And there's the problem. Because what we're trying to do, and what we've done with every attribute of God, is we've tried to describe the characteristic of an individual. So, you tell me. I want you to define for me what grace is. What's the grace of God? I'm assuming we all, well, let's just, I'm going to assume this. Let's just say we all agree that an attribute of God is that God is gracious. God is full of grace. What's grace? What's the grace of God? You tell me.
Bible college taught me unmerited favor.
Okay, unmerited favor.
God's riches at Christ's expense. Grace.
The fullness of our Father, of Jesus, of the Holy Spirit imparting themselves to us 24/7.
The fullness of the Father, Son, and Spirit imparting themselves to us. What was the last?
24/7.
24/7. Okay, all the time.
Without any withholding.
Okay. Anything else?
The Catholic one is grace is the Grace is the indelible.
Come on, nun.
Grace is the 26 and
Is what?
Let's get all
Grace is the invisible sign of the love of God through the sacraments.
Okay.
I think something like that.
Yeah. John?
Real simple, getting something we don't deserve.
Okay.
This is quoting Richard Rohr.
Wait, no, stop.
No,
Stop.
No Richard Rohr.
No, I don't want you to quote anybody.
No Richard Rohr.
And it's not even Richard Rohr. I just don't want you to quote anybody. I want you to tell me what you think grace is.
Yeah, I'm in favor.
Okay? So, now let's... Okay, whenever you talk, you whisper. You can't do that. I can't hear.
I'm a little timid to speak up.
That's okay, but
in
I need...
such a room.
Okay.
So it'd be some of my experiences with with God.
Okay, great, awesome, thank you. Because I could hear that. Thank you.
That's right, 'cause I feel really.
And you can whisper to Laura and she can tell me, okay? And that's just me because I'm getting too much of the Who in my ears. Nobody knows the Who? My Generation, Magic Bus, Pete Townsend.
Yeah.
Come on, man. You're killing me. Killing me, Smalls. Okay, so here's the thing. Now follow me first. This will take just a minute, but follow me. If God is essentially, in other words, his very nature, his essence, his being, as it were, God is relational. He's three persons, but one being. So his existence is a relational existence. In other words, relationship isn't something God does. It's not something he takes on. It's what he is. He is relationship. Are you with me so far? That's Christian orthodoxy. This is the Nicene Creed, Constantinople. This is what... Anyway, God is relationship. Okay, so we come to God is grace. That means, number one, when you try to understand what grace is in God, what you're trying to describe is the way a relationship relates, not the characteristic of an individual.
Say that again for me, please.
Okay? What you're trying to describe, if God is relationship, is the way the relationship relates, not the characteristic of an individual. And you all gave me the characteristic of an individual. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying this is the disconnect that exists for us, that existed for me. And I was a teacher. Okay? I'm not the guy who's just sitting there learning. Once in a while he reads his Bible and occasionally goes to church. I'm a teacher. And the disconnect exists for me. Number two, if grace is the way in which God is trying to say, this is what our relationship is like, which one of them didn't deserve it? Guess what? You just have to throw that word out. Because it doesn't exist there. Right? Was there ever a time that the Spirit doesn't deserve the kindness and love of the Father or the Son? You understand? But you go, oh, wait. But then grace is only the way that God treats humans. No. We're talking about, this is something about the nature of God that exists in God before he creates. Are you still with me?
Yes, your son that was born, you stood in front of the freight train regardless of him deserving it.
Deserve has nothing to do with
It has
it.
nothing to do with it.
Exactly.
You just,
Or not deserving.
or not deserving it. Yeah. You just did it. You just loved it. That's it. That's all.
I love it. But yeah,
Real quick. But to make it a little more human, did you learn grace for your son by the grace you and your wife share already? Like, was there a history of grace between you such that now your offspring can receive the same grace because that's who you are?
well, there was, and there is,
Sure.
I think. But the love that I had for my wife was very different because I learned it.
Right.
I grew to love her
Right.
as I got to know her. With my son, I didn't know anything. He never talked to me. He never spoke to me. He never obeyed me. He never disobeyed me. He never said, thank you, Dad. Nothing. There has been no relationship, and I love him with every fiber of my being. And deserve has nothing to do with it. So when I think God is gracious, and so God being gracious is him somehow relating to someone else that doesn't deserve his love or kindness, stop. That doesn't exist in the three of them. And that's when we're trying to describe God, that is God. That's what we're trying to describe. So you need to do this with holiness, wrath, grace, You need to do it with everything. Do you realize what this meant for me? I'm a Bible college teacher. I literally need to go back to day one and start over. Because who I think God has been completely defined as an individual, not as a relationship. This changed everything. And we're talking now over a decade ago, we're talking almost 15 years ago, and I'm still trying to put this together. And I can't. And you know what's really cool? I'm okay with that.
So define wrath in terms of a relationship.
Well, that's a great question. So the first place I think I'd start would be, is wrath part of the essence of God? We agreed that grace was. Is wrath?
I would say so. He sure is after a lot of people in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but Jesus is what God has to say.
Pardon?
Jesus is what God has to say. God has a face, he looks like Jesus, so if he doesn't look like Jesus. And wrath is us not responding to the love of God. We've left our own resources. Wrath isn't God. We've been so influenced by a Zeus, by this Greek thought, by enlightenment of lightning bolts, versus who God, good nature and character of God really is. It's a paradigm we're seeing God through.
Boy, Bobby, you just said a mouthful. This is great.
He reads Richard Rohr.
That's great. Richard Rohr is great. But anyway, we've got to answer that because
If God is holy and righteous and just, wrath is a reality.
John, is wrath in English, is it the fury fire? Is that the same thing or is that two different things?
Well, again, before you guys are asking questions that what I'm trying to say politely is we can't ask yet until we answer this one. If it's part of the essence of God, then what we're saying, because what I'm hearing is wrath is the way God feels about what's wrong. Well, then how does he feel about it when there is nothing wrong? In other words, how does he feel when sin hasn't even happened yet? Does wrath exist? Well, if it's defined by how God feels or responds to what's wrong, and nothing has happened that's wrong, then does wrath exist? Which one of the three of them has done something wrong that would incur the wrath of the other? As though the one who did something wrong wouldn't have wrath equally. That's
People's reality is, you've always heard that we understand the nature of God through our earthly fathers.
Oh, I'm not saying, okay, don't misunderstand me, John. I'm not saying that our reality doesn't include wrath. And I'm not saying that God doesn't have wrath. What I'm asking is this a part of the nature of God? Is it something that's defined and understood within the being of God? And I would say, no, it's not.
Why? What matrix do you use to make that, or process do you determine it?
Because God is light and there's no darkness in him. And God exists before darkness exists. So that means if wrath has something to do with the way God responds to darkness, and there is no darkness, he doesn't have wrath. Katie, go ahead.
If God is love, then if there is wrath in God, then it has to be defined or understood within the context of love.
Yeah, and
so like you would stand in front of a train for your son, and that's a form of wrath.
That's a concept I can understand.
yeah. So eventually, and again, the way I would try and respond to your guys' questions is wrath is an expression of love. But wrath is not an attribute in the sense of it's part of the essence of God, part of his nature. It's something that he takes on. Whereas grace isn't something he takes on. He's always been gracious. Justice is not something he takes on. He's always been just. Holiness is not something he takes on. It's something he's always been. But there are things that he takes on and they're descriptions of the way that he responds to a fallen world. And one of them is wrath.
So we need to understand, we put that on him.
Well, no, I'm not saying that God doesn't have wrath. We do need to talk about, well, what is it? And that's why I said, I think, and Katie started to say that, it's an expression of love. But what's in it? How's it an expression of love? And we're way ahead of ourselves. This is like session 2 or 5, or okay. But I'm just, what I'm trying to do, what I want to help us to do is to come back here, and I want you to understand, for me, it's not a trauma, but it was a pretty big deal, because as a Bible teacher, I have to go back to the beginning. I have to open up my Bible, and every time I read the word God, I have to consciously think, Father, Son, Spirit, Father, Son, Spirit, Father, Son, Spirit, when my entire life has never thought that. Even though I believe that, that would be cognitive dissonance. So, what do my students get from me? Well, they're not going to get something different from what I said and what I've taught. So, I'm just perpetuating what was given to me, and I continue to perpetuate it. And I would say I'm perpetuating myth. God is not an individual, and he's not described or understood or defined as an individual. So when I'm trying to understand the being and essence of God and who he's like and what he's like, because, by the way, that's what eternal life is. Eternal life is to know this being. That's what my Bible says. It's what Jesus said. It's what Jesus prayed, actually. Okay? So, to know him is life. So what we're talking about here isn't just theological, kind of discussion and banter. No, to know him is life. And again, I'm not talking about just knowing him intellectually, what he's like. I'm talking about knowing him experientially, knowing him in my being. Okay? Knowing him, what we would say, intimately. Relationally. This has so many tentacles that go out. When I would talk about or think about or teach about salvation, this I mentioned, for me, salvation was quite literally salvation by education. So when I would read the word believe, like in the Gospel of John, believe and you'll have eternal life, it was believe the right thing about Jesus. But that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is using this as a relational word. He's saying, the one who trusts me. Why? Because I am the truth, John. I'm not teaching you the truth. I am teaching you the truth, but that's not the point. I'm the truth. I'm not going to give you life if you do the right thing. I am life. If you trust me, you have life. If you're connected to me, you have life. This is a relational reality. Now, what's so bizarre about this is I thought in terms of what a person had to do to quote unquote be saved, to use that language, was that I somehow had to have the right information, and basically it was a transaction. God did something, you respond with the right response, and he gives you eternal life. So eternal life is a commodity. It's a gift he gives you. And Jesus says, wait a minute, I'm the truth. I'm the life. What does God give you when he gives you eternal life? Himself. Thank you. Eternal life isn't a commodity. It's not a thing. It's him. It's a relationship. Why? Because he is relationship. Again, so like everything that I had taught, everything I learned had to be rethought. I have to revisit. That's I don't even want to do it. I just spent almost 50 years doing it. But I was in my little raft. There's no way I'm going back. I'm bobbing up and down like a cork in this huge, big ocean. And it's the ocean of God's love. And he's going, I got you. Someone said something earlier today, and I don't want to correct it, but I want to just throw it out because I want us to maybe begin to consider to think a different way. God doesn't you know how like we run from God? Have you ever run from God? Coolest thing I ever found out, that as I was running from God, you know where God was? He was running with me. And I think I've left him behind because I'm trying to get away. And I don't look over there, and I don't look over there. He's not over there. He's right here. So as I'm running away, he's running with me. He's not going anywhere but where you go. And so, and didn't David say that? Wherever I go, you're there. Why? Because I'm there. So you're there. Because you're in me. And I'm in you. And Jesus said, on that day you'll know that you're in me and I'm in you. You didn't know it before, now you do. And then I go, well, I didn't know it before. I'm not sure I know it now. Well, we're working on that. So that's the beginning of my journey. Those were the first couple dominoes that started to just kind of teeter and go. And I know that for those of you who go to Coastlands, I know Chris has talked a lot about this. And I can't tell you how just delighted and excited I was to be with people that have been with my friend Chris, to know that they've been traveling in this journey for a while. And so I feel like there's things that we can talk about that you're not going to sit there and go, because I've had that happen before. And I have friends that have done that to me. So they didn't just do that, it was a lot worse. And guys, when this happened for me, I lost every invitation to speak. None of the people that I did church with even cared or bothered to find out what had changed in me. They just wrote me off.
29 years? 29 years?
Or more. Yeah. And then I would hear the rumors back. McMurray doesn't believe the Bible anymore. McMurray's a heretic. Huh?
What year was this?
How long ago was that? Those things? That was only about 10 years ago.
People, when you really came out, so to speak.
Yeah, so, kind of. So, I'm going to stop there. I will say this. I want to just read one thing to you. This is a book I wrote. I just finished a few months ago, and it's called A Spiritual Evolution: Rediscovering the Greatest Story Ever Told. And it's not a memoir, but it's memoir-like. I think Kathy read it. She referred to it today. It's my journey, and so most of the book is taking you through the questions, those questions that I finally gave myself permission to ask. It's taking you through those questions that I asked and where it led me. Away from this God who appeared to me to look like a monster. And when I found out what he was really like, he was better than I ever imagined he could be. And so I just wanted to, did you want to say something, Brad? Go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt your thought.
No.
Finish your thought.
No, go ahead. I'm just going to read something and we're going to close.
I'm just struck by it's personal and communal. There's probably people, I'm guessing there's people in this room that will relate to it, but maybe not. I think about when you talked about our relationship with God being transactional.
Mm-hmm.
I think about myself, a little boy, loving God, wanting to be close to God. I think about myself night after night after night after night, maybe hundreds of nights, sitting in my bed in the dark, trying to get the words just right to make sure that I would get to be with God. And all those Sunday mornings and all those Sunday nights and all those Wednesday nights and all those Billy Graham crusades and all those Bill Gothard seminars and all those things that I went to, as my parents loved me and tried to, just think about this wounded kid. And when you did that, when you ran across the room, I thought, he was sitting next to me in that bed. And I wasn't sure he was, and I was scared shitless. And also wanted to be close to him. It was fear and love at the same time.
Oh yeah. Oh boy, I know that one. You're torn. You're going to hear me say this a lot. There's so many tensions. The tension of loving what I fear and fearing what I love. And then realizing that I couldn't, that was unsustainable. I couldn't keep living there. Couldn't do it. I remember coming off Interstate 95. This would be like I-5 on the West Coast. 95 is like that on the East Coast that goes from Canada to the end of Florida. And I pulled off of Interstate 95 and I was so just done. And I was a junior in college. And I pulled into, it was a Howard Johnson's, if you guys remember what a Howard Johnson's was. It's like a restaurant thing, and it was closed, so the parking lot was empty, and it had rained. And in Florida, it's flat, so like there's always these rain puddles around. Doesn't drain real well. And I got out of my little 1968 Volkswagen, and there's this big puddle, and I literally just plopped down in the middle of it and just sat in the middle at like 12:30 at night and bawled my eyes out and said, God, I can't do this anymore. And that was as a young man. And then, here's what happened. It was almost like God goes, okay, we're halfway there. You finally admitted you can't do it anymore. That's great. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. And what I did was I picked up another formula. I gritted my teeth, got back on the bike, and started pedaling as hard as I could again. And God said, really? Okay, Thomas. Okay, Philip. I'll pedal with you. Let's go. Boy, is this going to be a mess. I don't know if he says, but it was a mess. But that's what I did. It was a window, it was an opportunity, and I kind of missed it. You could, I don't know, you could say you weren't ready for it, or I don't know, it doesn't matter. And again, that's a part where I won't jettison. That's part of my narrative, part of my story that is precious to me, that it made me part of who I am now. Including all of the dogmatism and all of the I'm right and you're not, that made me who I am now as well. All of that has shaped it's part of who I am. And it's part of why I have such an aversion to people who are arrogant, and that we don't come to these things with humility. Because I didn't. And I saw what it did in me and in the lives of the people that I related to.